Ugh. Right. Full disclosure, this video is going to take a dark turn. Hopefully you will enjoy it anyway, but characters are going to die. A kingdom is going to fall, and everything is going to change. And not in a fun way. Maya Govanan Melanin, and welcome to another installment in this series explaining and breaking down Tolkien's epic First Age tale of the Children of Húrin. And since the events of the last video, in which Túrin came to the kingdom of Nargothrond, where his black blade was reforged, where he grew high in the favour of King Ordredreth, and where he was bestowed multiple new names, 5 years have now passed. 5 years of the super heroic Turin wielding Gurthang, the Iron of Death, against the armies of Morgoth. 5 years of leading the elves of Nargothrond and ruling all matters of war beyond their kingdom's borders. 5 years of the Mormegil. However, although we are now over 7 hours into the story, and although we've already seen a great deal of conflict already, there is one thing that I think has so far been conspicuously absent from the tale of the Children of Húrin, and that is a consistent villain. I mean, obviously, Morgoth is the overarching villain of everything, but due in part to the Dark Lord's astoundingly pathetic cowardice, and also due in part to High King Fingolfin's astoundingly epic awesomeness 40 years ago, Morgoth will never again leave his fortress of Angband. He is the worst thing in the universe, and he is of course a huge deal, but he is also a pretty hands-off villain. But in this video, I am going to introduce a new villain into the story. A villain who is anything but hands-off. He is arguably Morgoth's most dangerous servant at this time. He is an agent of Morgoth's curse, and he will go on to be one of the greatest disasters ever to befall the Children of Húrin. So, just before I get back to Túrin and Gwyndor and Ordredreth and Finduilas and the other elves of Nargothrond, first, I want to take a few moments to talk about this villain, Glaurung the Golden, Middle-earth's first ever dragon. Now, Glaurung is, of course, not a brand new character. If you've been watching this First Age playlist in order, you'll already know who he is. But it is in this story that the character is really going to shine. The first time we ever saw Glaurung was 235 years before the events of this video, and back then he was yet young and scarce half grown. During his youth, Glaurung issued from Angband to wither the besieging elves with dragon fire, but interestingly without the permission of his master Morgoth. Now, luckily for the good guys, Prince Finnegan was an absolute legend, and with a company of swift horse-mounted archers, he was able to encircle Glaurung, and together they forced him back inside Angband, where he would not come forth again for 195 years. The next time we saw Glaurung, Father of Dragons, was in the Battle of Sudden Flame, that Dagor Bragolak, in which Glaurung was responsible for a good deal of the Sudden Flame. By then he was fully grown in both size and might, and he absolutely devastated the eastern lands of Beleriand, burning much of the territory belonging to the Sons of Feanor. 17 years after that came the disastrous Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, which I've already talked a lot about in this series. And, as you'll already know, in that battle, Glaurung the Golden burst onto the field of battle with a brood of lesser dragons behind him, potentially his children. In that battle, the strength and terror of the great worm Glaurung was now great indeed, and elves and men withered before him. However, before I move on, there is a very interesting question about the power of Morgoth that is posed by the existence of Glaurung. On the one hand, we know for a fact that neither Morgoth nor his successor Sauron can ever create life. They are not Ilúvatar. They do not possess the secret fire. They cannot make a Fëa, a spirit, a soul. All that evil can do is corrupt. That is a very important part of the Legendarium's philosophy. And yet, there is Glaurung, seemingly created by Morgoth to be a thinking, sentient, speaking being with a will of his own. So, how is this possible? What did Morgoth do to bring Glaurung into the world? Well, any answer to this requires a little bit of speculating. Tolkien never gave us an explicit explanation, but he gave us enough to form some pretty interesting ideas. And the first thing, I guess, that needs to be said in regards to Glaurung's origins and his nature is that just because he can speak, that does not automatically mean he has a Fëa. In some of his later and more philosophical essays, Tolkien wrote, "I think it must be assumed that talking is not necessarily the sign of the possession of a rational soul or Fëa. The orcs were beasts of humanized shape to mock men and elves. Their talking was really reeling off records. Melkor taught them speech, and as they bred, they inherited this." So, was Glaurung originally just some beast that Morgoth enhanced and, taught to speak? Well, maybe. Birds and beasts, despite not having Fëa, are still very much active inhabitants of Middle-earth. In the Second Age, some wicked beasts will fight on the side of Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance, and in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and The Silmarillion, we see wolves and crows and crebine, vampire bats, serpents, hellhawks, and loads of other birds and beasts demonstrating loyalty to both Dark Lords, not just as pets, but as active servants. And if there is one real-world animal that Glaurung is consistently compared to over and over and over again by Tolkien, that animal would be a serpent. So, a straightforward speculation on Glaurung's origins might go something like this. At some point, after returning to Middle-earth, Morgoth became aware of a particularly large and cunning and wicked serpent living in Beleriand. He probably brought the serpent back to Angband, he taught it speech there, and he invested it with a huge amount of his own power, and in so doing he corrupted it into one of his mightiest servants. Over time, this great worm became more and more Morgoth-ized, I guess, until it was imbued with enough of the Dark Lord's evil influence that it eventually gained abhorrent and unnatural abilities such as a fiery breath, psychic mind-bending magic that we'll see more of a little bit later, and, presumably, legs. Until, at last, this beast became the Dark Lord's magnum opus, the serpent that he took and turned into Glaurung. However, there is potentially still a little bit more to this. In the Children of Húrin, we are told that Glaurung speaks by the evil spirit that was in him. Now, we know this evil spirit cannot be a brand new Fëa, Morgoth is not Ilúvatar, but it could either be a corrupted Fëa, or it's possible that Glaurung's body, his Hroa, is inhabited by some unknown dark spirit, perhaps even a dark Maya in the service of Morgoth. And if that's the case, it would potentially make Glaurung a little bit more like one of the Balrogs, or even Sauron, than he is just a corrupted animal, a beast. We know that Morgoth definitely does have some incredibly mysterious spirits of shadow that serve him in Middle-earth, and his werewolves are described by Tolkien as creatures that walk in wolf shape, but are inhabited by dreadful spirits. So Glaurung might also have some of that going on. Anyway, regardless of where we land on his origins, believe me, we'll be seeing a lot more of Glaurung just a little later in this video. But before we do, there is another recurring character who we've not seen much of in quite some time, and he too is going to play a crucial role in this part of the story, and that is my joint number one favourite elf of all time. A guy I simply cannot not talk about. Wonderful, wonderful Cirdan the Shipwright. So, Cirdan. Until the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, he was the lord of two coastal havens, Eglarest and Brythombar. But then those cities fell to the power of Morgoth, and now Cirdan is the lord of the mouths of Sirion, right down in the uttermost south of Beleriand. And without wanting to go into spoilers, I will say Cirdan's decision to guide a group of refugees to safety in the south rather than ride off to do war in the north is arguably the reason why the First Age has, any survivors. I don't think it's too overdramatic to suggest that by the end of this age, Cirdan will be an oft overlooked and entirely underrated saviour of all free peoples. Anyway, as his title may suggest, Cirdan the Shipwright is a builder of boats and a lover of the sea. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, he will be the oldest named elf in all of Middle-earth, and he will have spent well over 10,000 years living in and ruling over a few different havens on Middle-earth's coasts. And the reason he does this, the reason he didn't just sail west way back during the years of starlight along with so many of the other sea-loving elves, is fascinating. In The Peoples of Middle-earth, in some of Tolkien's last writings, he states that Cirdan's greatest desire is to sail away from Middle-earth and to behold the blessed realm of Valinor in the uttermost west. That's what he's wanted since a time before the Silmarils, before Feanor, before the sun and the moon. And yet, for 10,000 years, Cirdan forfeited that desire. Instead, he remained for age after age after age on the shores of the sea, looking west but never sailing there, not until the last ship. And the reason for that is because Cirdan has a destiny. Way back, 3,300 years before the sun was even a thing, Cirdan beheld a light in the west, and he cried aloud, "I will follow that light." for the ship that I have been building is now almost ready." But even as he said this, he received in his heart a message, which he knew to come from the Valar, though in his mind it was remembered as a voice, speaking in his own tongue. And this voice came with a warning. Cirdan must remain in Middle-earth. He must build the ships that others may sail west on. And he must build one ship in particular. And that ship is going to change the world. After hearing this message, Cirdan beheld a vision of a white boat shining above him that sailed west through the air, and as it dwindled in the distance, it looked like a star. Now, the reason that I mention this randomly specific detail from almost 4,000 years before the Children of Húrin takes place is because if we now fast forward to the years of the Mormegil, to that half-decade when Turin, son of Húrin, ruled all matters of war in Nargothrond, far away in the south, Cirdan the shipwright received another message from the Valar, another warning, and this one is going to be very relevant to Túrin. Just like my other joint favourite elf of all time, the fantabulous Finrod Felagund, Cirdan the shipwright also receives a helpful little heads up from Ulmo himself, one of the mightiest of all the Valar, the king of the sea, the dweller in the deep, and the lord of all waters. He who loves both elves and men, and never abandoned them, not even when they lay under the wrath of the rest of the Valar. It is partly thanks to Ulmo that we even have a kingdom called Nargothrond. It is also thanks to Ulmo that we have a secret city called Gondolin. And right here we see Ulmo helping out again, guiding the free peoples again, which, let me reiterate, is a bit of a naughty thing for him to do. The Valar are not supposed to be in any way involved with the elves and men of Middle-earth, and yet, once again, the rules just don't seem to apply to Ulmo. Anyway, for very obvious reasons, Ulmo chose Cirdan the shipwright to be the bearer of his warning, and so he one day appeared before Cirdan, saying to him, "The evil of the north has defiled the springs of Cirdan, and my power withdraws from the fingers of the flowing waters. But a worse thing is yet to come forth. Say therefore to the Lord of Nargothrond, shut your doors, and go not abroad. Cast the stones of your pride into the loud river, that the creeping evil may not find the gate." So, not exactly the kind of message you would want to hear, but a very important one to deliver. Cirdan chose 2 messengers from among his followers, and he sent them off on a journey north to find the king of Nargothrond and to warn him of Ulmo's words. An army of evil is on its way, and with it comes something worse. Shut your doors and hide. Now, don't forget, technically, the king of Nargothrond at this time is Ordreth, of the Golden House of Finarfin, but, in Tolkien's own words, Túrin now commanded all the forces of Nargothrond, and would order all things as he wished or thought good. And so, with these two messengers setting off to deliver Ulmo's warning to the Lord of Nargothrond, my very long tangent about Glaurung the Golden and Cirdan the Shipwright finally segues us back over to the son of Húrin. And I really do need to hit this nail on the head. At this point in our story, Turin, or Agarwine, or the Adanavel, or the Mormegil, whatever you want to call him, he is at the absolute pinnacle of cool. Arguably, never again will Turin ever achieve this level of epic battlefield badassery. For the past 5 years, he's not so much been defending Nargothrond as he's been reconquering the wild, actively seeking out and attacking the servants of Morgoth. And he's been doing a great job. Generally speaking, the century that follows the Nirnaeth Arnoediad is a deeply dark and depressing chapter in Middle-earth's history. But for 5 years towards the beginning of it, there was a time of respite and hope, when, because of the deeds of the Mormegil, the power of Morgoth was stemmed west of Sirion, and all the woods had peace. The rest of this video may not reflect Turin's finest moment, but I really do think that is worth holding on to. Because of Túrin, for 5 years, the people of the woods have peace. They have respite, and they have hope. This is the wider context of who Túrin has grown into during his time as the Mormegil. And that's who he is on the day that he meets those two messengers sent by Cirdan the Shipwright. Interestingly, both of these messengers, whose names are Gelmir and Armenas, introduce themselves as being of Arngrod's people. And, depending on which version we go with, Arngrod was either the brother of King Ordreth, or, in later writings, he was Ordreth's father. It would seem Cirdan chose the right messengers. Shut the doors of your fortress, and go not abroad. Cast the stones of your pride into the loud river, that the creeping evil may not find the gate. King Ordreth finds these words of warning appropriately dark, and so he does what he's now grown so used to doing. He asks Túrin for counsel. But Túrin remains unconvinced. He says to the messengers, in scorn, "What does Cirdan know?" What does Cirdan know? Right, I really like Túrin. I think he's a great character, and typically I would defend him most of the time. But what does Cirdan know? Delivered in a tone of scorn, has got to be the dumbest combination of words ever uttered in Middle-earth's history. What does Cirdan know? Everything! Basically, the dude is a living embodiment of wisdom. When Cirdan tells you to do something or not to do something, you should bloody well listen. Listen to Cirdan. The guy is always right. What does Cirdan know? You're a moron, Túrin. Anyway, after saying the four silliest words in the entire Legendarium, then Túrin actually goes on to make quite a good point. He effectively says, if this worse thing is yet coming forth, is it not better for us to muster an army and ride out to meet it in battle, rather than fall back and hide? But Gelmir and Armenas have no answer to this. They are messengers, not strategists. All they've come for is to deliver Cirdan's warning. Ulmo says they should shut their doors. Ulmo says do not go abroad. And next to that, what more is there to say? Once their task is done, Gelmir and Armenas depart, back down south to Cirdan, leaving Turin and Ordreth to ponder the words of Ulmo. Cast down the stones of your pride. There is really only one way to interpret that, and Turin is right to interpret it the way he does. What Ulmo is saying here is that Turin must suffer the tearing down of his great bridge, the mighty bridge that he ordered the Noldor to build so that he might lead Nargothrond's armies out to war all the swifter. To cast it down would be to end the Mormegil, to go back in life, something that we know Turin cannot do. And so, upon his command, the bridge stays standing. The armies of Nargothrond prepare for war, and Cirdan's warning, Ulmo's warning, goes unheeded. Which brings us to the beginning of Morgoth's reconquest of Beleriand. Right here lies the island of Tol Sirion, which was originally occupied by the one and only Finrod Felagund, before he gave it to his younger brother/nephew, Ordreth. However, by this point in the story, it is known throughout Beleriand as Sauron's Isle. And in the words of Cirdan's messengers, upon this island there is a great gathering of orcs and evil creatures, and a host is mustering. By summer's end, this army of evil is ready to march south. But Sauron's Isle is still a long way from Nargothrond, and before they can fight the battle to determine the fate of that kingdom, first they have to get to the guarded plain, Talath Dirnen. And to do that, to make ready for their advance, first they must secure the crossings of Tyrglin. However, the crossings of Tyrglin lie right on the doorstep of the Forest of Brethiel. And as you'll hopefully recall, the Forest of Brethiel is home to a group of woodland-dwelling men, belonging to the mysterious and rustic house of Haleth. And although the woodsmen of Brethiel do adopt a general policy of keeping to themselves, they are allied to the elves of Doriath, and they despise the servants of Morgoth. At this moment in their history, the chieftain of the House of Haleth and the leader of all men in the Forest of Brethiel is a warrior called Hundir. And it's very easy to forget, but Hundir is actually a very close relative of the children of Húrin. They are all part of the same extended family. This can get quite complicated, but basically, Húrin's father, so Túrin's grandfather, his name was Galdor, and he was the chieftain of the House of Hador. At the same time, a guy called Haldir was the chieftain of the House of Haleth. What's interesting though is that Haldir had a sister and she married Galdor, and Galdor had a sister and she married Haldir. The sons of Galdor and Haldir's sister were the brothers Húrin and Huor, and the son of Haldir and Galdor's sister was this Hundir guy. Which means Lord Hundir and Lord Húrin are double first cousins. They share all four of the same grandparents, and if we're to wade into genetics for a second, they have as much DNA in common as your average half-siblings would. So, although Túrin, the Mormegil, has never met this Hundir Lord of Brethiel, and as you'll see in a second, they never will meet, they are indeed each other's double first cousin once removed. Anyway, it is Hundir, Lord of Brethiel, who leads what's left of the House of Húrin in their defense of their woodland home, and under his command, they give battle at the crossings of Tyrglin, challenging the advance of Morgoth's army. However, this time, their enemy is not some warband in the wild. This isn't a scattering of orcs. This is a force of invasion. A military horde that's been mustering for years with the sole intention of conquering Nargothrond, breaking its Mormegil, and destroying all resistance in the wild. Against an army like that, the woodsman had no hope of victory. At the crossings of Tyrglin, Lord Hundir was slain in battle. Many of his men died about him, and the rest were worsted. The survivors were driven back into their woods, where they sought safety in secret isolation, deep, deep inside the shelter of their forest. And there they took a new chief, a new lord of their people, Hundir's son, a guy called Brandir. And although that's pretty much all I've got to say about the woodsman in this video, Lord Brandir and the last remnants of his people living secluded in the forest of Brethiel are going to become very important in the final act of this story, when Brandir's second cousin, Turin Turambar, will find himself in their part of the world. But right now I am going to leave the woodsmen in Brethiel, what's left of them, and I'm going to focus instead on Morgoth's army, as it successfully crosses into West Beleriand. With a road now open for invasion, Morgoth perceives that this is his moment to strike, and so he unleashes upon Beleriand his greatest achievement. Glaurung the Golden, the Great Worm, the father of dragons. Upon being set loose, Glaurung passed over the gasping dust of Anfauglith and journeyed southwest, leading a great army of orcs in his train. However, Glaurung did not travel in a straight line towards where he believed he'd find Nargothrond. Instead, he went first to the springs of Aethel Ivrin, those beautiful, almost sacred pools of healing and goodness where the river Narog is fed its water. And Glaurung didn't just destroy this wonderful place, he defiled it. He uprooted trees, he burned all that was green, and he broke the stone basin so that the waters strayed and turned the land into what will later be described as a barren marsh and a welter of mire. After that, Glaurung looked with an eye of destruction upon the south. He led his army past the border into the realm of Nargothrond, and he burned Talath Dirnen, the guarded plain, setting alight all the lands between Narog and Tyrglin. And in so doing, Glaurung came to the attention of the Mormegil. When scouts returned to Nargothrond with harrowing stories of orc invasion and dragon fire, Turin's response was immediate. The warriors of Nargothrond went forth, and tall and terrible on that day looked Túrin, and the heart of the host was uplifted as he rode on the right hand of Ordreth. Now, I want to take a quick moment here to give a little bit of love to King Ordreth, I haven't always been his most enthusiastic supporter, but I will say at least this is a king who is willing to fight his own battles. And I think that's made all the more meaningful by the fact that he absolutely does not need to be here. Túrin is the warrior. He's the one that the army is looking to, and he's already Nargothrond's king in all but name. Ordredreth even kind of seems to be okay with that, and so I do really appreciate him showing up anyway. Especially considering that I don't think Ordredreth has ever been in a battle before. His first ever mention, chronologically, in the story was way back in Valinor during the early days of Feanor's rebellion. And back then, Ordredreth alone, of Finarfin's sons, sought to calm the Noldor, persuading them to pause and ponder ere deeds were done that could not be undone. Calm, cautious, and circumspect. That has always been Ordredreth's way. He never took part in the kinslaying. There's no mention of him fighting in either the Dagor Aglareb or the Dagor Bragolak, and we know for a fact that he actively avoided participating in the Nir Naiath Arnoediad or any of the conflicts since prior to this one. It's true, he was the warden of Tol Sirion when Sauron conquered it with an army of werewolves, so he may have seen some fighting on that day, but he didn't ride out to it. He was attacked in his home, and when Sauron did attack the island, we are told that a dark cloud of fear fell upon those that defended it, and Ordredreth was driven out pretty quickly. So not exactly a battle. Anyway, my point is, this riding out to do battle against an army and a dragon must have been an uncomfortably unfamiliar experience for Ordredreth. I can't imagine he would have been enjoying any part of it. And I can only imagine how he must have felt when he saw Glaurung himself, and a multitude of orcs far larger than what his scouts had indicated. And how does one defend against dragonfire? What happened next is remembered in the annals of Beleriand as the Battle of Tumhalad. However, despite its importance to this story, we actually know very little about the details of what went down at Tumhalad. What we do know, however, is that alongside the captain and the king, Turin and Ordredreth, there also fought Turin's buddy, Prince Gwyndor. And for Prince Gwyndor, this is the third devastating battle that he has fought in the past 4 decades. But just before I get into the specifics of the battle itself, I briefly want to speculate on another character who isn't ever stated to be present at Tumhalad, but we do have enough evidence to suggest he might have been. And that is the future Second Age legend, Celebrimbor, the guy who is destined to one day forge Rings of Power. So, these are the facts. During the tale of Beren and Luthien, Nargothrond was home to the 2 worst sons of Feanor, Celegorm the Fair and Curufin the Crafty, both of whom are terrible, terrible people. During that story, they were banished from Nargothrond by, of all people, their cousin Ordredreth, on account of them being such terrible individuals. And then after that, of course, they went on to try and murder Beren and Luthien, because terrible. But there was one redeeming feature. Curufin the Crafty the son who is most like his father Feanor in terms of skill and mood and wicked temper, Curfein has a son of his own, Feanor's only grandchild, and that son of Curfein's is Celebrimbor. But what I find really awesome is that although Celebrimbor totally did inherit his father and his grandfather's skill when it comes to crafting, he did not inherit their darker traits. It's true, Celebrimbor is destined to stand at the center of some dodgy things in the Second Age, but at the end of the day, he is, I think, a good guy. When his father and his uncle were exiled by Ordreth, Celebrimbor repudiated the deeds of his father, and he remained in Nargothrond. And that is the only time Celebrimbor is ever mentioned in the First Age. All we know is that he remained estranged from his father, and then he shows up again in a big way in the Second Age. And so, a little bit of speculation is required to bridge that gap. Perhaps Celebrimbor honed his skills as a craftsman by apprenticing with the smiths of Nargothrond. Or maybe he was the one instructing them. Maybe he even played a role in the reforging of Gurthang, hoping to redeem the dishonor of his immediate family. Maybe, in the background, during this battle, a relatively young Lord Celebrimbor might have been present. As I say, it's just speculation. Tolkien doesn't confirm anything, and honestly, it's not really even relevant to the children of Húrin, but it is a cool rabbit hole to go down. Anyway, as you are probably already aware, the Battle of Tumhalad is not going to go well for our heroes. The army of Nargothrond has grown mighty, but they've never fought on a field like this before, and none of them have ever faced Dragonfire. Of all peoples in Beleriand, it is only the dwarves of the Blue Mountains that have any defense against Glaurung's fiery breath, for they forged these great fireproof masks that could withstand the approach of the dragon. But there is only one dwarf-forged mask in Nargothrond, and that was claimed by Túrin. He alone can endure Glaurung's coming, but the rest of the elves, the people who have followed him into this battle, they are consumed by it. When Glaurung unleashes his inferno, all the pride and the host of Nargothrond withered away. And in the very forefront of that battle, King Ordreth was slain. After thousands and thousands of years of living a cautious, careful life, it only took 5 years of knowing the Mormegil for that careful life to be turned to ash. And of the elves that aren't swallowed up by dragonfire, many others are cut down by the hateful legions of orcs. Túrin fights on, of course, like an absolute legend, and due to his reputation, his dwarf-forged mask, and his epic black sword Gurthang, all enemies fled before him. But then he saw his beloved buddy, Gwyndor, stuck where the fighting was thickest. And as the surviving elves broke into a disorganized retreat, Prince Gwyndor was cut down and wounded to the death. Túrin rode to his aid. He bore Gwyndor up onto his horse, and together they fled from the enemy and escaped into nearby woodland. There, Túrin lay Gwyndor in the grass, and he saw that his friend's body was indeed beyond healing. Prince Gwyndor is about to depart Middle-earth forever in death, and there is nothing Túrin can do but hold him and listen to his last words. Gwyndor says, "Though I love you, son of Húrin, yet I rue the day that I took you from the orcs. But for your prowess and your pride, still I should have love and life, and Nargothrond should yet stand a while. Now, if you love me, leave me. Haste you to Nargothrond and save Finduilas. She alone stands between you and your doom. If you fail her, it shall not fail to find you. Farewell." And with that, Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn, dies in Túrin's arms. It's hard to think of many other elves who have suffered quite as much as Gwyndor suffered in such a short period of time. 40 years ago, Gwyndor and his brother Gelmir rode off to do glorious battle at the Fen of Cerec. But the whole thing went horribly wrong. Gwyndor was almost killed and Gelmir was captured. 17 years later, Gwyndor rode off to battle again, but this time it was not for glory but for justice, or at least vengeance for Gelmir. However, instead of rescuing his brother, Gwyndor watched Gelmir die. He watched his warriors die, and then he too was captured, imprisoned and enslaved for 17 years in the pits of Angband. But then Gwyndor finally escaped. He fled into the wild and ran all the way into Túrin's tale. He brought Túrin back to Nargothrond, and in so doing he lost everything. His honor, his position, the woman he loves. And 5 years later he loses his home, his king, and now his life. And the worst part of it is, since escaping from Angband, Gwyndor has been consistently right about everything. And yet this is his reward. But despite the unrelenting tragedy of his character, Prince Gwyndor does at least die with a flicker of hope. Túrin yet lives. Túrin, it would seem, is untouchable, and surely Túrin will save Finduilas. So long as she survives, Nargothrond's ruin will not be utterly complete. And so, after laying Gwyndor to rest on a grassy glade in a wood not far from Tumhalad, Túrin speeds with the utmost haste back towards Nargothrond. But by the time he arrives at the great gates, he finds that he is too late. So, I want to explore what happens next from the perspective of Princess Finduilas. As the warriors rode out with their king and their captain towards battle, the women and the other non-combatants stayed behind, awaiting their return. And I imagine in that time it would have been the Princess Finduilas that the people of Nargothrond looked to for leadership. So just try and imagine how harrowing it must have been for Finduilas to look out across the guarded plain, awaiting the return of her father and her lover and her people. But what she sees instead is the approach of the dragon that killed them. And behind him, an army of darkness that has come to her kingdom for a single purpose: destruction. In this hour, Nargothrond Stone Bridge, the pride of Túrin, connecting the formerly hidden doors of Felagund to the far side of the river Narog, the thing Cirdan warned him to cast down, proves to be an evil. For a bridge works both ways. And just as it did allow for Nargothrond's armies to swiftly march out of their secret kingdom, now it allows the armies of Morgoth to sweep in. Turin's bridge is Nargothrond's final weakness. And because it was so grand and so great, it could not be thrown down in time. So the orcs swarm readily over the deep river, and Glaurung comes against the doors of Felagund in full fire. There is nothing Finduilas can do but watch. And once the great doors of Felagund are overthrown, Glaurung and his army pass inside, and the once indomitable kingdom of Finrod Felagund is finally dominated. Now, the battle for Nargothrond is over, and the sack of Nargothrond has begun. And what a ghastly event this is. The underground city is defiled with indignity, and any untrained elves who tried to defend their home were either slain or driven off. The great hall of Finrod Felagund, the chambers where Beren and Luthien may once have walked, the wondrous caverns originally delved by long-lost dwarves, they are all plundered and despoiled. Of the women, the maidens, many were burned alive by Glaurung or slaughtered by orcs, and those that weren't murdered were herded on the terrace before the doors as slaves to be taken to Angband. And at the head of these desperate slaves, staring down a fate far worse than death, stands poor Finduilas, who must surely be imagining that she is now bound to suffer the same cruel fate that Gwyndor suffered, except without any hope of escape. However, it is at this hellacious moment of ruin and woe that Túrin makes it back to Nargothrond. And when he sees the horror that's being inflicted upon the innocent civilians of his home, his fury rises so great that none could withstand him, or would not, though he struck down all before him and passed over the bridge and hewed his way towards the captives. Even after everything he's been through today, Túrin is still a one-man army, willing to do whatever it takes to keep his promise to Gwyndor and to rescue Finduilas and the other captives. Not a single orc can or will stand against him, and if orcs were all that Morgoth sent, I certainly think it possible that Túrin could have turned the tide of Nargothrond's ruin even this late in the game. But it was not just orcs. And in the very moment that Túrin fought his way past the gates of Felagund, Glaurung the spell issued from the city, and there, Turin and the dragon have their first conversation. Now, the very first thing that Glaurung says to him is, "Hail, son of Húrin." There is no beating around the bush with any adopted names like Mormagil or Agarwine or Adanavel. Glaurung knows from the very get-go that this is Húrin's cursed son. When Túrin sees the dragon, he springs about with fire in his eyes. He strides against Glaurung, and the edges of Gurthang shine as with flame. But against the son of Húrin, Glaurung uses a different weapon than teeth or claws or dragonfire. Instead, he demonstrates the power of his evil spells, his mind-breaking magic. Glaurung opens wide his serpent eyes and he gazes upon Túrin. Túrin stares back defiantly and he raises up his sword, but straight away he falls beneath the dragon's dreadful spell. He is frozen in place, as one turned to stone, unmoving and silent. And with Túrin trapped, unable to do anything, Glaurung begins to play mind games. He taunts Túrin, saying, "Evil have been all your ways, son of Húrin," and he uses just enough of the truth to make his downright lies all the more insidious. No matter what you think of Túrin, evil have been all his ways is indisputably not the case. Glaurung is lying. But Túrin was a thankless fosterling. That's not a lie. He was an outlaw, and he did technically slay his best friend. While being under the dragon's spell, Túrin hearkens to these words, and he saw himself as in a mirror misshapen by malice, and he loathed what he saw. More so than any other character, except obviously Morgoth, Glaurung is an agent of the curse. He has no intention of killing Túrin. In fact, he straight up refuses to kill Túrin. That would be far too kind for a character so cruel as Glaurung. Instead, he tells Túrin a lie that will effectively, and in a bit of a roundabout way, go on to destroy the lives of the children of Húrin. The dragon tells Túrin about his mother, Morwen, and his sister, Nienor. He tells Túrin that back home in Dorlomin, Morwen and Nienor are living as slaves, going in rags, cursing Túrin's name for their suffering, whilst also yearning for his help. But according to Glaurung, Túrin does not care. Here he is, arrayed as a prince, whilst his mother, the woman who saved him from thraldom, is now a thrall herself. His sister, a woman he's never even met, is now suffering a terrible fate that he escaped. From the very beginning of this story, Tolkien has emphasized over and over Túrin's love for his ancestral home, his loyalty to his kin, and his devotion to family. The thought of Morwen and Nienor suffering as slaves whilst he roams free, that is to Turin utterly unconscionable. And yet, while he's here held by the gaze of Glaurung, unable to escape the torment in his mind or even stir any part of his body, the remaining orcs drive away the captives, herding Finduilas and the other prisoners away from Nargothrond towards Angband. As Finduilas passes Túrin, she holds out her arms and calls him by name, but he is as powerless to help her as he is powerless to break free of the dragon's spell. It's not until Finduilas's cries and the wailing of the other prisoners have faded far from hearing upon the northward road that Glaurung finally releases Túrin, and Túrin awakes as if from some hideous dream. Immediately he tries to slay the dragon, but Glaurung simply laughs. His master has a far crueler fate in mind for the cursed son of Húrin than a quick death by dragonfire. And so Glaurung tells Túrin to go freely, go north, and make his choice. Either he must return to Dor Lomine to rescue his mother and his sister and his people from a fate worse than death, or he must go after Finduilas and the captives of Nargothrond and save them from a fate worse than death. But he can't save them all. He can't do his duty as the Lord of the House of Hador and also honor the dying wish of his buddy Gwyndor. Whatever choice he makes, it has to be terrible. Now, I will, of course, continue this story thread in future videos, but I do think it's important to tell you that although there is no right choice here, Túrin definitely makes the wrong choice. There's no way he could have known it, this is utterly not his fault, but there is a crucial piece of information missing. There is one fact that he does not have, and that is that Glaurung is lying. Morwen and Nienor aren't even in Dor Lomine anymore. They've been having an adventure of their own. They are not slaves. The truth is, they don't need him. But Finduilas, she desperately needs her Mormegil. And he needed her. Once again, Gwyndor was right. Finduilas alone stands between Túrin and his doom. But Túrin made the other choice. He chooses family. And he leaves Finduilas and the rest of Nargothrond's captives to suffer at the mercy of the orcs. And so, as an act of cruelty, Glaurung lets Túrin go, and Túrin hastens away from Nargothrond towards his next misadventure. And throughout the rest of his life, he will never return to this kingdom. For the former realm of Finrod Felagund now has a new king, a dragon king. And having accomplished the errand of his master, Glaurung laughed, and then he turned to his own pleasure. He let out a blast of fire, presumably killing many of the orcs around him. He drove away the surviving orcs, and he denied his army any and all plunder, even down to the very last thing of worth. Glaurung named it all unto himself. Then he broke Turin's great stone bridge. He gathered all the riches of Nargothrond and he piled them into a heap in the great hall of Felagund. And there, in the most dragon-like fashion, he hoarded the treasure of his enemies, and he declared himself the new and only king of Nargothrond. Now, I will of course return to Glaurung. I will of course return to Túrin and his terrible choice and all the troubles that he still got to go through. But in the next video, I want to take a brief break from that and explore instead something a little bit different. Because I have spent so much time talking about our hero Túrin that it's very easy to forget there is another child of Húrin's out there. Túrin has a sister. And although he's never met her, she too is destined to one day come face to face with King Glaurung. She is now 22 years old, and she is ready to take her place within the history of Middle-earth. So, to make sure you don't miss the story of Nienor, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to click like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Navair Melanin.